Dear students, today in this discussion we are going to delve deep to ascertain whether John Keats was merely a sensuous poet or something else. Let's begin. Sensuous poetry is not devoted to an idea or philosophical thought. Its aim is mainly directed to the task of giving delight to the senses. The quality of sensuousness in poetry appeals to the sense of sight, hearing, touch, smell, or taste. Keats has been regarded as the most sensuous poet in the realm of English poetry. His poems reflect the poet's passionate love for all that is beautiful, whether that beauty belongs to art, nature, or woman. Beauty is one of the major hallmarks of his poetry. On November 22, 1817, Keats, in a letter to Bailey, expressed his views on the role of sensation in his own scheme of poetry. In that letter, he said that he preferred to know the world through his senses. From his early boyhood, Keats had a very sharp sense of sight, of taste, of touch, and of smell. Not only this, Keats was able to penetrate deep below the physical surface. He could see truth behind beauty, so he wrote to Bailey, "What imagination seizes as beauty must be truth." He could also perceive truth in such strong passion as love. In his famous ode on a Grecian urn, he says, "Beauty is truth, truth beauty." His perception of truth was so acute that in most cases beauty looked pale before truth. And still he craved for a life of imagination, of beauty, of sensations rather than of thought. Keats once said, "Oh, for a life of sensation rather than of thought." Sensations, therefore, became in Keats the gateways to truth. The sensation of the beautiful can be compared to truth as one compares youth to maturity. So, a life of sensations, he wrote to Bailey, was a vision in the form of youth, a shadow of reality to come. That life and poetry had organic growth. That was a constant theme with the Romantic poets. "Child is the father of man," said Wordsworth. Keats also thought in the similar vein that life, despite of its bitter aspect, must represent maturity through sensations, imagination, beauty, and truth. The truth that dawns later in life is only a finer tone of the earlier sense of beauty. So he was certain of the fact that a poet can develop into maturity if he grows out of sensation and moves towards thoughts. Thoughts in Keats follow sensation. His whole poetry is the growth of thoughts through sensations of truth, through beauty. In other words, even in Shakespeare it was slow but steady growth. But with Keats, it was very rapid and it quickly reached the point of perfection. His life blossomed fate suddenly as if it were in a flash. Keats was a complex mind. He could see and perceive, imagine and reflect, sense and judge intently, who exists partly on sensation, partly on thought. He asked Bailey. At last he would not, because he knew that years must bring philosophical mind where both thought and sensation were completely blended. In his Ode to Autumn, the season of autumn is described in sensuous terms, in which all the senses are called forth. Season of mists and mellow fruitfulness, close bosom friend of the maturing sun, Keats is adept in creating a word picture. With the help of a few words, he presents a real picture. For example, in Law Belisand's Mercy. Similarly, we find exquisite examples of sense, of hearing, of taste in his poetry. Forlorn, the very word is like a bell to toll me back from thee to my soul self. Oh, for a beaker full of the true, the blissful Hippocrene. She found me roots of relish sweet, of honey wild and manna dew. Autumn is a remarkable example of Keats' sensuousness. It's exquisitely described as season of mists and mellow fruitfulness, close bosom friend of the maturing sun. Autumn is also described as a thresher, sitting carelessly on a granary floor, and her hair soft lifted by the winnowing wind, or as a reaper, or on a half-reaped furrow sound asleep, drowsed with the fume of poppies. Even we find Keats' epithets rich in sensuous quality. These are watery clearness, delicious face, melodious plot, azure lidded sleep, sunburnt mirth, embalmed darkness, anguished moist. Keats not only is adept in creating sensuous phrases, but he uses sensuous imagery also, with beaded bubbles winking at the brim. The fact is that Keats' delight in pure sensation was a temporary phase in him. His sympathies broadened as his mind became maturer. It's surprising to note that he felt through the senses the enkindling of spirit. So we do find in Keats a sensuous mystic. Indeed, Keats was well aware of the fact that the ultimate reality is not material. It means that objects perceived by senses are also not material. They must be spiritual. By spiritual, Keats meant the regular order of nature. Following nature, Keats always lived in the present. Nothing startles me, he said in one of his letters to Ballet, beyond the moment. Keats' indulgence of senses didn't provide him an escape from the world of pain because he was always half in love with death. Indeed, dying always seemed a bliss to Keats in the moments when he was at ease. He was aware that death dwells with beauty, for beauty must die. Joy for Keats was always short-lived and ready to bid adieu to a human heart. He knew well that in the moments of pleasure one feels the pain of it. In his Ode to Melancholy, Keats points out that melancholy dwells with beauty. In his Ode to Melancholy, Keats points out that melancholy dwells with beauty, beauty that must die, and joy whose hand is ever at his lips bidding adieu. What the poet wants to convey to the readers is that the joys of life in fact make man melancholy. It's because joy is, by its very nature, short-lived. The idea behind this ode is that man must enjoy the pleasures of life to their fullest intensity. It's because these pleasures are always temporary in nature, but one must always prepare oneself well in advance for the gloomy period of life also. Keats thus lived both pleasures and pain equally well. He thought that both represented to him the principle of beauty and of truth. It makes the order of nature where spring is as good as autumn or even winter. All seasons, all joys and sorrows, beauty and ugliness represent the law, the spirit that participates in all phenomenon. It's this truth that gives both beauty and meaning to it. It's true that sometimes Keats' sensuousness enters sensuality. Still, it cannot be said that he vulgarized love. It's because if he described the warmth of passion, he equally well showed its short-lived nature. Keats described bodily love from a detached point of view. For him, senses and the mind both are equally powerful. Keats knows very well his indulgence in sensuousness. That's why he kept it under check in the poetry in his maturer phase. Thus, we find that Keats' poetry is not merely a record of sense impressions. It's a spontaneous overflow of his imagination kindled by the senses. He hears the song of the nightingale and is filled with deep joy, which at once kindles his imagination. He has been hearing the actual song of the nightingale, but when his imagination is excited, he hears the eternal voice of the nightingale singing from the beginning of time. He sees the beauty of the Grecian urn and the figures carved upon it. His imagination is stirred, and he hears in his imagination the music of the piper. Heard melodies are sweet, but those unheard are sweeter. Of course, unheard melodies were sweeter to Keats too. He writes about sensuous poetry, but he goes beyond the surface level of the physical world of beauty. So it's wrong to call him a poet of only senses. Thank you very much, students. You can find out relevant portion from what I spoke to you, what I discussed here in this question, and you may utilize that portion in your notes, in your question answers when you feel the need.